founders have such a hard job and such a lonely job. Building a 10 million, 20 million, 30 million pound business is hard work. And I think people underestimate the amount of personal sacrifice that goes into that. Treat them with humanity and respect and allow them to exit a business with grace and with reputation, right? It helps everybody.
Welcome to the Startup CEO Succession Podcast, where we dive deep into the pivotal journey of founder CEOs who face the critical decision: should you continue leading your business or bring in a new leader? I'm your host, Evgeny Shadchnev. As a founder coach and author specializing in CEO succession, I interview founders, chief executives, and investors who share their stories of navigating this transition. Today, I'm speaking with Maria Josife, partner at Erevena, an executive search firm. With over 12 years of experience leading CEO and C-suite appointments at VC-backed technology companies, Maria has seen many CEO transitions from the inside. In our conversation, we'll discuss how to make sure it goes well the first time, how to approach it with grace and wisdom. Enjoy the conversation. Well, Maria, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. How are you?
Yeah, I'm really well, thank you. And thank you very much for having me.
I'm so much looking forward to the conversation because you and your firm, Erevena, has so much experience when it comes to CEO succession. But to kick things off, can you give a brief description of what does Erevena do?
Yeah, of course. So Erevena are effectively a headhunter. That's our core business. And we've been, I suppose, in the market for the last 20 years supporting investor-backed businesses. So our real specialism is working with companies who have taken money from venture capital, from private equity, and who are growth-focused, scaling businesses, usually with a tech or tech-enabled kind of underbelly. So lots of work in sectors like software, lots of work in sectors like fintech, consumer marketplaces, health tech, education tech, and related categories. But really our core expertise is helping to build growth-focused companies that are privately owned.
Yeah. And you've got years of experience in this area. You're a partner at Erevena, so you've seen quite a lot of executive appointments.
I've been a partner at Erevena for 12 years now, and the company's probably existed for 20 years, albeit that Erevena, as it's known today, has really grown rapidly over the last decade or so. And so I've seen our company grow from 10 people to over 70. We've opened international offices. We've managed to help our clients develop networks of talent all across Europe and in the US. And so it's been an incredible journey, which really has kind of mirrored the growth of particularly the venture sector, but also the kind of private equity sector more broadly over that time. So yes, we've been around a long time in that market. We've worked on hundreds of appointments at the C-suite and at board level across that subject matter. And I guess we're probably one of the biggest players in that space in the European market now. We've managed to become probably the largest European version of our type in the market. We've seen lots of interesting companies grow over that period of time.
Yeah. And for our conversation specifically about CEO appointments in venture-backed companies, this is your particular area of expertise. If I understand, you specialize in senior executive appointments.
Yeah, so I do two things for the firm. My first hat, I guess, is I lead our fintech group, and I'm particularly focused on the fintech market in terms of the work that I do. But within that, I've always specialized in commercial appointments and particularly in general management, which is a key area for me. And so naturally over time, that's kind of led me into the CEO space. And so, yes, I do a lot of our CEO appointments, or indeed some of the big appointments that I would describe as founder augmentation, which is another way of looking at CEO succession.
Yeah. So let's kick off our conversation by talking about the circumstances that bring venture-backed startups to consider changing the CEO, whether it's driven by the founder CEO themselves or by the board. Why do companies come to this
Change
idea?
CEOs. It is so individual to each company. There are some situations where it's a self-selection on the part of the founder. So where they reach a point, sometimes of having walked up a mountain for such a long period of time, they don't feel like they're the right person to take the business on its next journey and its next chapter. It's something that is a big part of that founder succession journey. In some instances, it is slightly more complicated. Maybe there are some things that the founder does extremely well. They're an incredible source of product innovation. They are an incredible source of external profile raising. But actually, the business gets to a size and scale where the mechanics of running that business day to day and some of the kind of obligations from a people management perspective, some of that kind of stuff starts to become an energy suck for them. And so they will look at ways in which they can make their role maybe more exciting, more motivating, more interesting for them on a personal level, whilst remaining present in the company in some capacity. So sometimes the conversation feels a little bit more like that. It's not that someone's reached the end of the road, but there's maybe parts of the job that they're not enjoying as much as other parts of the job, and they're trying to think about how to make their work a bit more fun again. That's a big reason. Sometimes it's a situation where the company is maybe moving very quickly between two investment theses, and the founder has found it difficult to make that transition. That's been particularly true over the last couple of years, I would say, where we have definitely seen, particularly in late stage venture, but more generally as well, a kind of tolerance for high burn rates diminish, a tolerance for huge capital raises without, at least some level of profitability or path to profitability visible. Those kinds of things have become very prevalent in the market. And I think, when a founder has been growing a business in one direction for a really long time and then suddenly has to pivot to something completely different, some of them just can't change that quickly. I know that sounds almost silly, but it's almost like the movement from A to B is a mindset shift that they find really hard to deal with. And sometimes that will make the board question whether they're the right person to deliver that transition. And then sometimes they'll end up in our offices because the board have mandated some kind of change. And I think that threads through to other circumstances where boards lose confidence around founders. Sometimes it can be also at a stage of maturity where the types of investors around the table change quite dramatically. And I think that definitely happens later stage, particularly around growth capital, where the sophistication of the investors, the level of financial data they require, and the depth of perspective they want on the business is at a completely different level to early stage investors. And some founders find that very difficult, particularly if they've not equipped themselves with other appointments in their business, whether that's CFO or it's board members who know what that's going to look and feel like. And sometimes that can be a reason why people lose confidence in a founder. Maybe the process of removing them or supporting them becomes a discussion.
So it sounds like there are several different reasons why CEO change might be on the cards. A founder might feel tired, or maybe they don't have the skills for the next stage of growth, or maybe the business changes direction, or there is a new private equity investor with their own idea of what a CEO should be like.
Yeah, or just a different level of expectation over how they want that business run that a founder can or can't live up to effectively. Yeah.
And how do you think about replacing the CEO versus augmenting their skills? Because there is also an option to hire a COO or a managing director or
Yeah.
an FD with a skill set that the business needs. How
Yeah.
do you think about it?
So this is a very personal point of view, but my honest opinion is that keeping founders in a business for as long as possible is always the ideal. I think founders bring something visionary and special to a company that it's really hard to replace. So I think keeping them involved actively and positively in the business is the ideal outcome. Unfortunately, a lot of these issues are rarely spoken about until it becomes a problem or a point of friction. And keeping a founder in a business relies on everybody having a level of self-awareness early, including the founder, right? So knowing that you're not feeling it, knowing that you're maybe struggling with some aspects of the job and seeking that help is a really positive way of giving yourself the time to look at different solutions. Unfortunately, when everybody leaves it till the last minute, which is usually when either the board are really disenfranchised and annoyed, frankly, or the founder has just had enough. When you get to those kinds of dynamics, looking at a solution where the founder gets to stay is really tough. You need to deal with that much earlier. But if you can deal with it much earlier, I always think it's the most positive solution. Either the founder staying in the business fundamentally as an external facing CEO with the capacity to be market facing, but with somebody else running the business and that succession happening over a longer period of time, or with the founder remaining as a positive influence on the board. And that will depend on their personal preferences as much as anything else.
And there is a bit of a paradox here, because often founders and investors avoid raising this topic out of
Yeah.
fear that, well, who knows how this conversation is going to go. It's high stakes. Maybe the founders might be afraid the investors will force them out. But actually, what
Yes.
you are saying is that by not discussing it, by delaying this conversation, founders and investors eventually get the company to a position where less constructive, less orderly transition is likely because there is less time to plan everything.
Totally. And I would say that's the common theme of almost every CEO succession project we've been involved in. There are always exceptions, but most of the time they start too late. And they start at a point where things are fractious in one way, shape, or form. They don't give themselves the time for a transition that is orderly, palatable, graceful, all of the things that you would want it to be in an ideal world, because something is ablaze somewhere in the mix, right? And that makes a big difference. I think the dialogue is starting to change around founders, and I applaud some of the work in particular that Balderton are doing at the moment around the kind of founder wellness suite, right? So Leah's kind of been talking about this an awful lot around the kind of idea of using a founder almost in the way that you would view a professional sports person, right? They don't have to be an island. Actually, the team around them in every sense makes a difference to their ability to endure. And consequently thinking about their professional health and their mental health and full wellness is important. But I do believe that things like coaches, things like non-executive directors who are genuinely independent are a really important part of this jigsaw, because I do think you're probably right. Founders find it difficult to raise this as a topic. When they do raise it, they're going to raise it with people they trust. And in that dynamic, particularly if they feel like they're not succeeding, or they feel like maybe there will be a period of time where they don't want to do this anymore, the people they're closest to are often their seed investors, because they've been there in the trenches with them over a period of time. But actually, probably the people driving financially are a very different set of investors by the time this comes up. There are so many different agendas around the board table that it can be really hard for a founder to understand how to bring it to life. And I do think having alternative points of connection who understand you, understand the company, helps in bringing some of that stuff to life.
And you mentioned coaches and non-execs. And of course, I'm the biggest fan of coaching as a coach, but also a good chair can play a crucial role here.
Exactly. Generally speaking, most people tend to bring in a chair as their first appointment, and then maybe non-execs slightly later, Series B, Series C, something along those lines, usually at a time when they tend to replace their chair as well and change that person into a slightly different model of chair. So there are lots of different stages where you can augment your business with non-executives of all varieties. But I definitely think having somebody who can act as a mentor, who you can talk to, who you can feel vulnerable with, is a very important part of developing yourself as a leader, full stop. And we have to remember that a lot of these people are doing it for the first time, right? They're not experienced CEOs. This is their first business, their second business. They haven't had the privilege of growing up working for other people who are brilliant CEOs. So it's not like they've learned those lessons by osmosis. So we have to support them in the context of running some pretty scaled businesses and really help them develop. And sometimes that means also giving them an ear when they're finding it difficult.
And you mentioned that in almost all cases, or maybe in most cases, founders and boards start this conversation a little bit too late.
Yeah, I
In
think
your
so.
experience, so when is the right time to start the conversation? When it is not too late yet?
I don't know when the right time is, but I know that by the time you get to the point where everybody is frustrated, it's gone way too far. That means the founder as well. The signs tend to show themselves in a variety of ways, sometimes around the positivity of the board discussion. Sometimes you'll see it in business performance. You'll start to see some plateaus. You'll start to see some signs where the business is maybe not growing in the way that it should. You'll start to see slightly fractious behavior at the board table. I think in a founder's heart, they probably know when it's starting to feel like a drag and they're starting to feel drained. But usually, that conversation happens, I think, at a point where everybody is already on the page that there is no other option other than exit. And that is way too late. It's way too late from a search timing perspective as well. But it's also way too late from the perspective of trying to retain the founder in the business.
And in your experience, so what is the timeline for a good transition? Starting from having conversation in the board, aligning on what needs to happen, and creating a brief for an executive search firm, appointing the firm,
Yeah.
which will also take time, and then the
Yeah.
interviews, the notice period. So the entire process. How
Yeah,
long
exactly.
does it take?
A lot longer than most people realize is the truth to that. The other thing that one has to be conscious of as part of that timeline is the amount of available funding. This is particularly true of venture-backed businesses. So what I'm going to say applies less to private equity, which tends to have a more outright ownership model. But in venture capital, usually there are chapters of fundraising. And no new CEO is going to want to join a business where they don't have the runway to establish themselves in that business. So the first point is that in the context of appointing a new CEO, you probably need them to have a year of funding available in the business for them to be able to actually do anything from the point they start. And that's a long time, particularly because if you look at people who are then the candidate base for those jobs, unless they are immediately available, which is a small slither of the overall pool of candidates for a CEO succession, generally they're going to have a notice period of between 3 and 6 months. So you're already talking about a year and a half. And then there's the kind of process to find that person. And that will be dictated somewhat by the criteria that you put around the appointment. And that's why I think starting these things early becomes a real enabler in finding the right talent, because you can consider, for example, people who are employed rather than people who are just in transition, because we're not desperate, right, for a solution. You can give some real time to situation planning around what you actually want this person to be and achieve. And that's a really important part of the process. But generally, a search for a CEO will take 6 months. People will tell you it can happen quicker, and I'm sure there's circumstances where it can. I would say most commonly it takes around 6 months to get a level of comfort with a candidate that they can be a successor. So now we're at nearly 2 years, right? It's a long time. And before that, you really need clarity on a bunch of really important questions. Now, working out what kind of shape of CEO you need maps absolutely to the business strategy. It is not a process that takes an enormous amount of time understanding what the business does, how it's going to win, what its direction is, what kind of experiences you need somebody to have, and then the creation of a scorecard that creates a job spec in the end. That bit doesn't take an enormous amount of time. I think what takes the time is getting comfortable with the distribution of responsibility. So if you want to keep that CEO engaged, for example, you want to keep them involved on the board, it's working out where their input stops and starts. It's working out what role they're going to have in selecting this person, if any. It's giving enough time to think about the subtle things that candidates will want to know whether they'll want to be involved in this business, right? And so kind of really giving time and thought to what is their job going to be versus this person? What are the reporting lines and responsibilities going to be? How long is the founder going to remain, if they're going to remain in an executive capacity? What kind of handover timetable are we working to? Is it 6 months? Is it a year? Because you have to be able to stick to it. What skills complement that founder? If we're looking to retain them in the business, what do we actually need around them to enable them to be successful? And how do we shape a role that sits in a complementary fashion? And then if you're really looking for the founder to stay, the chemistry piece is so important, right? It's like trusting someone with your baby. You don't just do it immediately and like that. You know, if you've ever taken your child to nursery or similar, you will remember the feeling of kind of wobbly hand handing over the child to a complete stranger and thinking, goodness, what am I doing? It, it's the same, right? This is something people have invested decades of their life in. It's so personal and important to them that they need time to build trust. And so, particularly when you want that founder to stay engaged and you want them to have a role in the business, regardless of what that role is, that relationship piece is as important than any skills that the CEO is going to do or be or have. And you've got to give time for the team to come with you as well on that journey. That's the other thing that I think people forget, is that a bunch of the executive will have signed up to work for the founder. And that replacement of that person has an emotional impact on the team as well. And so you have to have enough time to take that group of people with you on the journey. So I think when people start feeling like they want to start having this conversation, finding an avenue early to start having that dialogue and create a strong planning process around it is really important. Most people leave it until a point where it starts to show in business performance. And once a bunch of investors see an asset declining in its performance, that tends to be a trigger for a set of behaviors that mean that whole process won't go as well, basically.
So, in other words, people tend to wait until there is a urgency to act, but realistically, it's a 2-year, give or take,
Yeah,
process. And so it
yeah.
needs to be initiated when things are not urgent yet.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And I think you can help yourself in that. As I said, part of the point of having a good chair is that you should have somebody around you who's walked in your shoes and knows what it's like to be a CEO and can help you to identify some of these feelings. I think same with a coach. I think same with a chief people officer, right? If you've got a really great chief people officer in your business, they can start to be a confidant in these dynamics, or at least help you start to think about how you may want to augment your role or sustain yourself in the business in a way that you enjoy more. When it starts to feed through to business performance and you start to see the decline in the kind of overall performance of the asset, at that point in time, the conversation is more fractious.
Yeah. So the way I think about it, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this, is that it makes sense to start having preliminary, very open-ended conversation with a trusted person like a chair of the board at the point where the situation is not urgent yet, but the founder maybe has some questions whether they will still be the right person to run the business 2-3 years from now. And there is
Yes.
no urgency to act, but this can pave the way to an orderly transition if it needs to happen. Or maybe there will be another way to address the situation and the transition never happens, but just having this conversation enables the founder and the board to avoid a crisis.
I think so. I think it gives you the most optionality, right? Every founder will have a unique reason for wanting to have that conversation, and they will be profoundly different, But if the starting point of that conversation is, I'm not sure I'm going to enjoy this as much or be as successful as much when this company is 3 times the size, that's a very valid and self-aware points to raise that actually every leader should raise in the context of their role. And we talk about situation appropriate hiring, right? There are very few people who genuinely can go from tiny to massive. There are so few people that exist in the world that can do that. Most people have their sweet spot that they enjoy, that they perform better at. The way you allow a founder or support a founder to go from here to here is through the creation of the right team around them that give them the freedom to morph their job into the things that they excel at and the things that they enjoy. And the sooner you can start that conversation, absolutely the better, right? That is a very positive conversation. How do I get the best out of me as a leader of this business? What do I need around me in order for me to be my best self? Is a very, very positive conversation. Because if you ask most investors, they deeply want to retain founders in businesses. I don't think any investor starts investing in a company thinking, now's the time to exit the founder. It's actually something that most of them sit on for way too long because they don't want to do it, right? It's so counterintuitive to them. So I think the more that you can talk about that constantly in the course of your evolution as a CEO, the more likely you are to make appointments that really help you succeed, and the less likely you are to get to a point where you are removed from a business. Now, you may still self-select out of that business, and that's a different thing, but you're giving yourself the best shot of making it as far as you can.
And when you think about the journey from a tiny business to a much larger business, are there any inflection points in terms of maybe size of the team or something else where a change of a CEO becomes more likely?
No, I don't think there are inflection points that make the change of CEO more likely. But I definitely think there are inflection points where if you don't get your hiring strategy right, the likelihood of a change of CEO becomes more possible. There are a group of people who found companies, and then usually at some point in time, somewhere below 5 million of revenue, but not much less than that, there will be a point where the founder needs to appoint a range of what I'd call VPs, right? People who are first in function leaders who transition the business from founder led stuff to professional in function leaders. And usually those people are brilliant for the next 5 to 10 million of revenue, let's say 5 plus million of revenue. At a point where the company gets to product market fit or a level of product market fit, it's no longer needing to really think around corners. It's not thinking so much about that scrappy phase at the beginning, and it's starting to professionalize. It usually then needs a C-suite. And one of the things that a lot of companies get wrong is that they either hire that first VP level too early. So they put people in before the product really fits the market and they lose connection. That's a trigger point for things going wrong. Or they leave that VP level in too long to the point where the founder is stretched too acutely across too many dimensions of the business. So they're kind of being pulled outwards and upwards by profile, fundraising, complexity of investor relations, all of that stuff that just demands their time upwards. Or they are being pulled down into the organization because they don't have executives in place running those bits. They've got people who effectively are used to working down through a team as first line rather than across through an organization as an executive. So at that inflection point, when people leave it too long to augment themselves with a proper C team, that can be a trigger for things not going particularly well. And particularly at that point in time, that's usually somewhere between a B and a C stage, right? You'll put that proper executive in. At that point in time, it's also when your board becomes more complex, your cap table becomes more complex. You have lots of different investors with lots of different interests in there. You've got quite often, lots of investors with different theses in there, right? Who are investing in you for a very different reason and different outcome. and probably an investor in that pack who is a little bit more of a kind of private equity shaped growth investor who expects a whole bunch of stuff that your early investors never did. So all of these things happen at the same time. And so I think it's fair to say that when people don't build that capability into a team and continue to grow through it, they will naturally reach a point where they get crunched by all of those circumstances all at once. And we see that a lot with some of the late stage venture candidates. They haven't built a robust enough team. And so they can be really big from a revenue perspective, really unsophisticated internally. And that becomes a trigger when things then start to go wrong. There's nobody there that can help fix it. And so you get that kind of trigger for change as well. But there's some of the circumstances I'd see.
One way I think about the transition you're describing is a transition from a founder to CEO. And the founder
Mm,
might have had the CEO title from day one, but you are not really
mm,
CEO when you've got a team of 5 people. It's still
mm.
an early stage team and you act and behave like a founder because that's what the business needs. But
Yes,
at some point, as you've explained, the business needs its first proper senior management layer. And then the job changes because the founder CEO now has to manage through this layer of hierarchy. And that's a
yes,
different way of running the company.
yeah,
And
yeah.
it can be
And again,
counterintuitive.
totally. And the second version of that is when the company requires leaders of leaders of leaders. And so you get another layer of operational complexity. And quite often at that stage of growth, you actually find that the difficult area to change in your organization is actually the middle layer. So when things get later stage and there are performance problems, the CEO can sometimes be used to, okay, I lead these people lead these people, and it works. But suddenly you've got these people, and these people. And the bottom of the organization is often really frustrated and wanting change. The top of the organization is trying to deliver that change, but it gets lost somewhere in the middle. It gets a bit fat around the middle, is the truth. And so there's a different level of skill, I think, to lead an organization when it gets to that type of organizational complexity versus the me, them, some other people. It just changes. And I think every CEO has to change with that. And that's why I think if you're honest about where you get your energy from, where you excel as an individual, what you actually enjoy doing. I mean, I can say on a personal level, I love coaching people. I don't like managing people. And so you know the difference between those types of things, and you can shape yourself and your career. Hiring for your weaknesses is what keeps you in the role that you enjoy for the longest period of time. And that's why I think if you start these conversations really early around you as a leader and how you're going to build and grow yourself, the more likely outcome is that at some point in time you'll self-select a COO who might become the person that runs your business, and you will find a role as a founder, whether that's as an executive founder or on the board, that you really excel at and you enjoy.
In other words, there are several inflection points, several reasons why a CEO might have to reinvent themselves in order
Yes.
to keep growing with the business. And some people go through these transition points and others choose not to or try to but fail to.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you can recognize your strengths and weaknesses and which inflection points you may struggle with, your capacity to hire people around you who will support you through that as well, but who will be able to make up that delta is so much more likely.
And in your experience, what are the chances of a CEO change being successful? What proportion of candidates remain in their jobs long term when it comes to replacing a founder CEO?
I think they can be really successful sometimes. I think it depends on the starting point that you're walking that CEO into. One of the markers of success, I think, is that the founder has to be sincere in their delegation of responsibility. And that's an important one. There are some founders who can't help themselves. They hire somebody to work with and then bypass them or meddle around them. And that can be a difficult situation for a professional CEO or COO. So professional CEOs can be successful and do stay in tenure for a decent amount of time, usually towards some kind of exit. But the circumstances that they walk into will largely determine that. How transparent you've been on what the business actually wants and needs during the process, how honest the company has been about the financial situation that it's facing, how much of a company's issues are related to product market fit versus execution. That makes a big difference, right? If you need somebody to operate out of a situation, we've got enough money to be able to make change, deliver that change, raise more money. The likelihood is that a good operator will be able to do that. The product works. There are things that are broken about the org, or there are things that are broken about the way we're doing this. But ultimately, the product fits, people want it. Once they buy it, they're relatively sticky. And we can just operate more effectively to run this company better to deliver that product to market. We've got enough runway to do it. Those people will succeed. They will succeed. The ones that I think will find it much more challenging is the ones that kind of go into a situation where they discover things on day one. That's hard. And usually it's the amount of time to impact a situation, as I was going back to in that timetable, right? Most people need a year in a job to be able to kind of deliver some change, get a business in order, get it out to market to raise capital. They need time. And the people that don't have enough time will struggle. And, you do see companies going into administration after a period of tenure with a new CEO because they haven't been given that time. But no, I think a lot of COO appointments can be also very successful if they are set up in the right way. I started this whole thing by saying that my favorite position is always to keep a founder in the business if we can. But COO appointments can go very wrong, or president appointments, whatever you want to call them. They can go terribly wrong if they're set up badly. They're probably the worst, like the biggest point of failure and also the biggest point of success, depending on which way you go with them. But if you bring a COO into your business with the promise of making them CEO over a period of time, and then micromanage them, or don't give them the breadth or visibility, or try and sabotage them, or any of the kind of outcomes that sometimes get driven by ego, that is a disaster. You do see a bunch of those people not sticking.
And you mentioned bringing in a COO with an explicit intent to promote them to the top leadership position.
Yeah.
But what's your perspective on what I've seen several founder CEO do, bring in senior leaders without actually telling them that the intention is for them maybe be promoted, but only once the CEO makes a decision based on their performance. So in other words, the founder CEO would not really announce the intention to step down, but they would hire a CEO or the chief revenue officer or some other senior position, and then try to make a decision over the next year or two.
Yeah. I think there's nothing wrong with that as a means of finding succession. Where that can trip up is that quite often the type of person that is a functional leader who is still kind of rising in their career rarely wants to repeat the same cycle loads of times, right? So quite often when you make a C-suite appointment in a CRO role or in a CMO role or in a COO role or similar, by and large, you're appointing somebody who probably is 80% of that role and growing into it. Right? There are examples where people have done this multiple times before. But you're talking about candidates who you perceive to be potential CEOs, and people who are potential CEOs want to grow in the course of what they do. So the likelihood is that if you're not outwardly going out for somebody to replace you and not communicating that, the type of candidate you're going to attract in a functional role without that succession laid out is going to be naturally more junior. The danger in not declaring intent is that you hire people who do not have the capacity to be your successor in a time frame that's relevant to you. Not always, and people grow. But I would say if somebody has been multi-time functional leaders in the same function in similar growth businesses and have not progressed or shown the appetite to progress in terms of expanding their remit, they are probably not a CEO candidate. And if they are the type of person who has that appetite to progress and to expand their remit over a period of time, they may be stepping up into your C-suite role. There's the dilemma.
And how do you think about hiring first-time CEOs to replace the founder CEO versus a proven candidate with a track record of being a CEO?
Yeah. So again, I think it totally depends on the asset. There are some situations that are a really, really hard gig for a first-time CEO. And so one has to be conscious of that, right? There are some situations that we've witnessed where the board has been incredibly complex or the business is in quite a particular situation. A CEO learning their craft is probably going to be overexposed in that role, particularly if they don't have a very experienced chair. There is a caveat where if there is a very experienced chair who's leaning in or playing almost a demi-executive role, there are some makeups there that you can have. But by and large, those situations will be a very negative first CEO experience for someone. And people think a lot about this. They don't want to go take that step. They've waited ages to be a CEO. They don't want to take the step into something where their chances of failure are really, really high. So that matters to them a lot as well. And the board feel the same, right? The chances of failure are high. So we all feel uncomfortable in this situation. There are loads of other scenarios where I think it's great to hire first-time CEOs, right? The pool of repeat CEOs is small. So that cannot be the strategy for any search, really. But there are situations where there is a much greater opportunity for somebody to stretch and be successful versus step in and fail. That will dictate which one is most appropriate in which situation. That's why I prefer the internal passage, because you both get a bit of a time to understand the business, the dynamics, to just get a bit more information and grow up into a role. I think internal succession, where it can happen, is a much more positive way of doing things. But that relies on the timetable to be able to support it.
And how do you approach it as an executive search firm? Do you treat internal candidates as part of the overall pool without really differentiating them, but taking everyone through the same pipeline? Or
Yeah,
how does it work
absolutely.
from your perspective?
Absolutely. I mean, our job is, it's probably one of the most common mistakes that people make in terms of the relationship they have with executive search firms. We're not just recruiters. And I know mentally that's where kind of people get to, right? Your job is to put a bum on this seat. But actually, C-suite hiring is much more complex than that. Our job is to advise you on the right appointment. So I spend more of my time talking to businesses about what they need and how to create the right scorecards and how to create the right search strategy to lead to the right appointment and the right decision, as I do finding the person to sit in that seat. And so absolutely, our job is to advise on that appointment, regardless of where the candidate comes from. And actually, our neutrality is really important. I shouldn't feel like these are my candidates and these are somebody else's candidates, because that creates complexity that nobody needs in the search process. So yes, absolutely, we treat internal candidates in exactly the same way. They have the same experience, they get the same interviewing. We do the same reference checks on them, albeit that those reference checks are probably from known voices in the company versus external voices. But if the internal candidate is the right person, they should get the job. Benchmarking that is a really important part of CEO transition. You know, having a good feeling as a board that that person is your best option is something that makes you feel good and confident in them. But it's great if the candidate does come from within. And I think we set up our processes to be as neutral as possible in that decision.
And let's shift our attention to the founder CEO after they step down.
Mm.
How do you think about what's next for them? Is it best for them to stay within the business? And if so, is it a functional role or an AD role? Or is it best for them to just get out of the way and give
Yeah.
free rein to the new CEO? How do you think about the next steps for the outgoing CEO?
It is so personal to them and their skill set. I think the functional role in the business question really does rest on whether they have a functional expertise or a functional spike. If they're not qualified to be the CMO, they can't be the CMO. If they're not qualified to be the CPO, they can't be the CPO, regardless of whether they're the founder. And probably functional founders discover that earlier, right, in their journey than the most. So it's very hard for them to remain in the business in that role. I've seen some boards try to create innovation labs like roles for people where they are retained in the business to do some innovative stuff around product or whatever. They rarely last. I generally think they're a nice bridge for a founder to consider that a place they could stay, but most of them self-select out of it pretty quickly, to be honest, because their dynamic and culture changes and they self-select out. Where I've seen founders successfully remain in the company in two circumstances. One, where they've had a very orderly transition of COO to CEO and CEO then to founder or exec board member or similar. That has worked in many circumstances. It's largely because of the trust that's built up between those two, largely because the business has probably chosen to do that before an alarm bell needed pressing, and because they've had a good discussion around what their respective jobs would be, and also because they don't report to each other. And that's a really important dynamic, right? If you're bringing a COO into a company to run the business with the intention of a founder sitting in another role on the executive, another leadership role on the board, you have to have this structure, not this structure. So that person needs visibility to the board. They need to be an equal, and that sets the dynamic up well. So I've seen that work, and I've seen people transition to exec founder like roles for a period of time, not indefinitely, but for a period of time. I've also seen them transition onto the board successfully for a period of time. But usually, I think founders naturally, at some point in time, feel the urge to go again. And what I see most often is that they'll make that move for a couple of years and then step out and do something entirely different because it's just so core to their DNA. It's just who they are. So in the end, they all end up leaving their company, but I think it's more about the timing, the gracefulness of that make the biggest difference.
And if you think about founders listening to us or watching us right now, what advice would you give to those who might be considering stepping down at some point but haven't started this process, haven't spoken to anyone on the board yet?
Yeah.
What would you like them to know?
To take away. So I think the first thing is know yourself as a leader. The most important part of your development and your individual progress through the story that you're creating comes down to your self-awareness around the things that you're good and bad at and the things that you're going to need help with and all of that kind of stuff. So support yourself with people who you can talk to that probably aren't just your investors. That might be a coach. I think I'm a big believer in coaching, as we know. That might be a chair who is independent and not just somebody your investor has suggested you have, but somebody who you feel confident in that will add value to you as an individual. I think have those people around you. Don't be afraid to switch those people out as you need new direction and you need new augmentation, because people tend to be really appropriate for a chapter of time and a good set of solutions. And then maybe you'll need a different influence for the next one. But know yourself and know what motivates you and what makes you happy, and have that at the core of how you build teams and how you build the organization around you. I think be also not afraid of delegation. It's probably the thing that founders struggle with enormously, right? It's seeding bits of autonomy They're so used to controlling things in a really acute way that the biggest inflection is when they have to do this with their skill set, right? They have to focus up and out and trust other people to do stuff whilst keeping a close enough eye on what all those people are doing as a CEO to know that they have confidence in the outcome. That inflection in their behavior, I think, is a really important one. Don't be afraid of putting really great people around you. Actually, 90% of the founders that make it all the way through have been super low ego about the people that they've put in great C-suite roles. They've looked for fantastic talent, people that are probably better than them at certain stuff. And that creates the bench to allow you to grow and develop and allow you to have people around you who can do a bunch of the stuff that maybe you find de-energizing. If you get to the point where you're getting that this isn't working for me feeling, just say it to someone, find a trusted source and start having that conversation and get them to help you with having that conversation with your board. But don't leave it so long that the company starts to suffer, because ultimately it's something you've invested so much time in. Knowing when to step away from it is as powerful as all the things you've done to get there in the first place.
Indeed. And what would you like professional venture capitalists to know about CEO transition?
Oh, there's a very long list. So I think, first of all, empathy with candidates is a really important one, right? If you wouldn't do it, the chances are candidates wouldn't do it. So being realistic about what you're going to market with and giving yourself the best shot of taking that portfolio company to market to find a new CEO with the very best circumstances around it. So don't leave it too long. If all of you around the table are thinking we need a new CEO and you've been thinking that for months and months and months and months and you've done nothing about it, it's an error. That is your responsibility as a board, is to try and kind of make sure that you're going out to market with a company that is still able to attract great quality people. And they will need to see a company that has a united board, that has enough capital in it to be able to give them a good chance of getting the things that aren't going right motoring again, and that has kind of a board with a shared view of where the company is traveling to. So that's really important. I think organizing yourself around a process is also really important. We see a cacophony of voices sometimes around what the company needs or why it needs it or whether X or Y is the right direction. That's the homework a board should be doing in advance of engaging a headhunter, in advance of going through a pitch process, having a unified view of what they actually need. What is the company strategy? What's been failing? And what are we trying to solve for? Having that conversation up front is really important. And then having people in the process that will take responsibility for that. Somebody should run the process. You have to have a nominations committee. The other board members have to delegate responsibility to that nominations committee to say, okay, these are the 3 board members who are going to run this process. We're all clear on what we're looking for. We all think they all believe that. And now we're going to run a really strong process with momentum to attract the best quality talent. That's really important, organizing yourself so that it's not too many influences and too many different points of view, because searching for people is fundamentally a relatively linear process, right? We want to know what our priorities are, what are the most important things that we're trying to hit, where are we likely to find those people, and we build a whole search process around that. So if you're always hearing conflicting points of view, it can be very difficult to find a path through it. The other thing that I think is really important is also just honesty about the state of the business. Now, I would say in the course of the last year, I've probably seen one business that is growing at such a rate it's incredible, but the founders just want to put it in the hands of a professional CEO and kind of retreat and enjoy their lives in a slightly different way. I've seen one business where I'd say the founder had probably run out of steam, but the business was still performing really, really well. I've seen one where I think it's probably on the verge of bankruptcy. And we can go through all of these different scenarios. There's so many of them over the course of the year. The truth is that there is a horse for every course. And there is a different type of CEO that can walk into any of those situations, but they need to know what it is. The other thing I'd say to the board is be honest about the shape and health of the business. Sometimes they don't even know. And, you get that sense that they discover things the more and more they dig through information and the more they see of the business as they get closer to it through a CEO transition, the more they say, oh, wow, okay, I didn't know that was the case. But if you do know, be honest about it, because there are criteria that every candidate has, and they are different per candidate. So finding the right CEO is finding the right person that will embrace that challenge. And if we all know what that challenge is and we're communicating it and there are no horrendous surprises, the right person will turn up for it. I think that's really important as well. And just remembering that people have feelings. Founders have such a hard job and such a lonely job, and the amount of personal sacrifice that they've put into that situation to get a company to building a 10 million, 20 million, 30 million pound business is hard work. And I think people underestimate the amount of personal sacrifice that goes into that. Treat them with humanity and respect. I just think that's the other thing, right? Remember that they're also the person that got you there in the first place, and try and find ways to allow them to exit a business with grace and with reputation, right? It helps everybody. It stops them being their worst selves. It gives them a shot of kind of being supportive of the business. It gives them a shot of helping you find the right person. I think just try and manage those things in a way that gives everybody a kind out. I think that is an important thing too.
Yep, empathy and respect. Maria, thank you so much. I'm sure lots and lots of founders and investors will find this conversation both interesting and useful, and I'm really grateful to you for sharing your experience.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me.
As we are wrapping up our conversation, I would like to highlight 3 key insights that Maria shared on this podcast. The first one is that open and honest communication is paramount. It doesn't serve anyone to wait until things are so difficult and urgent that the board has to talk about replacing the CEO. It's so much easier to start the conversation earlier when it's not a crisis yet. And here, an experienced person like a chair or a non-executive director or maybe an early stage investor could really make a difference. The second point is that letting go is an act of leadership. Sometimes the best thing that a founder can do for their business is to step aside and facilitate the appointment of the leader for the next stage. And this requires tremendous courage. I know it from my own personal experience of stepping down as a CEO at Makers. And last but not least, Maria emphasized how important it is to approach the entire process with humanity and respect. It's really not the right time to have a big fight and figure out who is right and who is wrong. If the board can manage to approach the entire CEO succession process with respect for the outgoing founder, ultimately it will serve everyone in the long run. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Don't forget to like and subscribe on the platform of your choice, and see you next time.